I'm Deacon Rada. I'm a permaculture instructor focusing on social permaculture, and within that, focusing on economics. And I'm joined by Wesley.
Yeah, I'm Wesley Little, and I am a therapist, and I'm going to be learning from Deacon what these concepts mean. And so maybe anyone who's watching is going to learn with me because these might be new for whoever's watching as well.
And I do find that even within like the audience of people for whom permaculture is like made, it is frequently like a completely unknown thing. So sometimes I do frequently, somebody will ask me something about permaculture and I'll start talking with the assumption that they know, and they're just like, wait, you got to slow down. What is permaculture?
Yes.
So it's really tough. Should we just start there?
Yeah, that's a good, so what is permaculture?
So it's interesting. It is kind of a portmanteau, words smashed together of like possibly permanence and culture. But in the earlier days, from what I've read, it was meant to be a portmanteau of permanence and agriculture. So the idea was that it was an agrarian model for not requiring inputs from outside of the site. So for designing a site that, even if in the very beginning it required inputs from outside, after it was running, when the design was complete, the only inputs it would require would be like the sun, the wind, rain, appropriate to its region, right? So that's like the origin of permaculture.
Wait, so let me ask a question already. Okay, so what's an example of a site?
A site. So a site would be like a farm or a garden. In most cases, with like, traditional, like what most permaculturists think of as permaculture. It's usually like what is thought of now as a small scale farm, but would have been a pretty standard issue family farm, for our grandparents or great grandparents, right? Anywhere in the U.S. or still like in places where people do still have family farms. Like where permaculture is a little bit bigger in like Japan, in Central America, Guatemala, Costa Rica. Those are places that are really big on permaculture. There's still a lot of small parcel farms. When I say small parcel, I mean like, between 10 and 100 acres, whereas most commercial farms now are much, much bigger than that.
Okay, so I'm going to describe like how I'm thinking of this, and you're going to kindly like help me. You'll laugh at me, or you'll be like, okay, no, this is the right way to think about this. Okay, so you have a site like a farm, and you're saying permanent agriculture or permaculture would be that you could get the farm to a point where it only needs essentially like the elements and then the people tending the farm to succeed.
Yes, and even this is an interesting yes and. So that's actually perfect, but increasingly less of the people tending the farm. So okay. Permaculture is very oriented towards, there's somebody revving something out. I don't know if that's even coming through.
No, I can't hear it.
Can't hear it. That's great. It's a wonderful microphone. But ideally, you want to design your site so it actually requires less human input as well. And actually, the more significant thing is it requires less mechanized input, specifically big, heavy fossil fuel burning mechanization. Like it's not necessarily like you're trying to eliminate mechanization altogether. Permaculturists are not anti-technology. They're not anti-machine or anything like that.
Okay.
It's actually about like lowering the kilocalorie input. And depending on which permaculturist you talk to, they'll talk about it in those terms. A lot of permaculturists also pull in biodynamic or biointensive techniques, which are very similar. It's just two different tracks of the same line of study. And in biointensive, you measure kilocalorie input versus kilocalorie output, right? So we might think of a traditional farm as being incredibly efficient, right? It has one person, or even sometimes no people, because a lot of tractors now are run by robots, like, which is a thing that is not necessarily known to a lot of people, but robots drive most tractors. They're GPS guided, and they just go back and forth, and they do all the, thank you so much. I'm getting all these wonderful things. I just got teeth.
Oh, very nice.
Not from a robot, from Ramona. I want to mention that because I'm talking about robots being automated to do things. So we think like, oh, that's incredibly efficient in terms of human labor. If you have a robot driving your tractor, harvesting your corn, and there's nobody working your farm, which works for things like corn and wheat and stuff like that. Obviously, people are still picking other things by hand, but this is what's depressed the value of labor, right? This is like why tomato pickers get paid so little labor, is because they're competing with robots.
Okay.
In terms of the overall market, not for picking tomatoes, because robots can't do that yet. But the thing is, the kilocalorie input is still enormous because that tractor is burning gas, right? So if we think about actually what's going in, like the actual inputs, and as we go like green, that tractor might be burning ethanol, right? So is that tractor even burning? Like, is it even producing enough corn to produce the fuel that it's running on? And the answer is going to be yes, but it's not. But once we actually look at it in terms of that, like kilocalorie input output, it's like it's not efficient anymore. Like it's So that's a major factor.
Okay, so if I'm following, then part of what a permaculturist would do is that they're really looking at the big picture, where they're saying, okay, it's not as simple as we have some rows of corn and a machine would be more efficient time-wise or like labor-wise. We would also have to look at what is the machine burning in order to complete that labor, and does that make sense big picture with what we're producing?
Yes.
Yeah. So if it takes like, 100 corn plants to fuel the robot harvester, I never thought I would ever say a sentence like that. So if it takes 100 corn plants to fuel the robot harvester, but you're using the robot harvester to only harvest 80 corn plants, you would say, what are we doing here? Like this doesn't add up.
But even if the robotic work produced 120 units of corn, right? That would still be not super great. It's like, okay, we just consumed an acre to get a net 20 units of corn. Yes. And that's all we got. Like there's no other value that came out of it. And that's the other thing, is that permaculture is very whole systems oriented. So you're never just looking at a single metric. And so there are actually a bunch of analytical tools that are used in permaculture for analysis of whole systems that are very different than the tools used in like what we usually refer to as business as usual, or like the BAU, that measure a very narrow kind of efficiency. So we're looking at the overall health of different aspects of the system.
Yeah.
And so we can look at one parcel of land, and maybe we put a ton of design effort into it, and maybe there's still like that same piece of land that you could just have one robot and a sprinkler getting corn out of. Now we've got 3 people working in it, and you might look at that and say like, wow, like I thought this was supposed to be efficient. And it's like, oh, but those 3 people are getting much more food at a higher nutrient density. They're getting social value out of it. They're getting, cultural value out of it. We've made the space itself beautiful. There's a kindergarten that's run out of the same space. There's like, so you stack all these functions up, and you get enormously more out of a smaller unit of land and out of fewer resources, because when you stack functions, you end up using much less to get all of your needs met.
I think I understand that. I can see that. So you're really looking at the big picture of input and output, and what, looking at a lot of different elements of like, how is this benefiting the system? Like, how is this benefiting the people? How is it benefiting the earth? How is it benefiting the climate? Like you're kind of looking at like, how does this benefit or cost these different systems?
Yes. So we have actually 8 of the 8 chunks of benefit that are in that set. And those are like the 8 forms of capital. So that's like the thing I've been posting about recently on Instagram.
Okay.
So in that, like when we talk about benefiting the earth, we're talking about natural capital.
Okay.
Right. And there's this way in which, depending on how you view permaculture, it's not selfless. We're not talking about benefiting the earth like we need to save the earth. We're talking about benefiting the earth like the earth is probably going to be fine and would shake us off if it came time to do so. The earth is actually pretty resilient as a system and isn't really very attached to any one species. I think like if the geological record has shown us anything, it's that like the living earth ecosystem, it doesn't really care which set of species are alive. It just produces vibrant life you know, that's
Mhm.
what the earth does. And so when we're thinking about natural capital, we want robust living systems. We want to take care of what is alive and what is alive around us. But there's a kind of utilitarian way you could look at it, which is we're familiar with the species that are dominant now. And what we understand of the earth is that when humans wipe things out, something else rises up, right? So we get destructive to, one thing or another, like we've clear cut a bunch of forests and now we've got invasive ailanthus and they're destroying the foundations of our houses, right? Well, the ailanthus tree is not native to the US and there was just a tiny amount of it that somebody brought into LA for stupid reasons like 100 years ago. But the ailanthus couldn't have taken over so much. Do you know what I'm talking about? The tree of heaven, the like people sometimes call it like poison sumac, or not poison sumac, something like it's like a false sumac. It has leaves that look like sumac. But they're the trees that, if you know any arborists, they like hate them or they love them because they get paid a lot to remove them because they'll destroy the foundations of houses.
Okay.
Well, like they're one of those species that can't really outcompete healthy, robust like systems. Like
Mhm.
if you have healthy soil and big hardy trees, those things will keep out weeds. I mean, this is like the case with any kind of weed, is
Mhm.
like actually robust, long-lived perennial plants, like don't make space for weeds. But
Okay.
those plants take longer to be established, right?
Mhm.
Weeds can move in fast, they can move in hard, but they need vacancy, right?
Mhm.
And so when we're talking about like protecting the earth, and this is I think, a very critical thing, it's there are some species around us that we're familiar with. There's some systems around us that we're familiar with. We've developed like our survival mechanisms in symbiosis with all the things around us, all the living, like there are life forms that people kind of just think are just natural things, like carrots. Like carrots aren't natural. We made those. Like we developed alongside them for years and years. Carrots and potatoes. Like there was no vegetable that grew this big bulbous root full of starch just for its own benefit. That doesn't benefit the plant. That benefits us. So we developed with that thing. We developed
Mm.
with all of these different things. Tomatoes, when they were natural, like all of them were cherry tomatoes. Cherry tomatoes would have been the biggest of tomatoes. We bred them to suit our purposes, and that also suits their purposes, right?
Mhm.
Because we are carrying them along and propagating them, and from their like kind of selfish interest, they're like, yeah, we want to thrive just like everything
Mhm.
else wants to thrive. And so we have
Mhm.
all these symbioses we formed with everything around us. And if we don't steward those things, then they die, and something's going to move in,
Mhm.
right? In every sense. And this goes from like the trees that are around us that might destroy the foundations of our homes to plants that may be toxic or like all kinds of things. Something's going to move in if we decimate anything. And
Mhm.
what we see is like we decimate life, and sometimes the things that move in are like cute and kind of annoying, like squirrels. Like, right? It's like squirrels are kind of like I love squirrels actually, but a lot of people hate squirrels. Like, but sometimes it's rats, and sometimes it's
Mhm.
cockroaches, and sometimes it's like that's what happens when we aren't good stewards of the living systems that we have an impact on. And so
Mhm.
permaculture seeks to rectify that. It's like when we're protecting capital, we're actually protecting the species that we've been partners with for centuries.
Mhm.
So it's still pretty selfish. We're just expanding the idea of self to be like our
Yeah.
whole team at a multi-species level.